Do you feel bad for what you did? No. That's fucking awful. Hey, they thought Hitler was big, dude. Yeah, I'm matching him.
It happened on June 15th, 2023, a Thursday afternoon, in a quiet Ohio township where nothing like this was supposed to happen. Inside a home in Monroe Township, just outside Cincinnati, a father picked up a rifle and turned it on his own family. Not strangers, not intruders, his children. 7-year-old Clayton, 4-year-old Hunter, 3-year-old Chase. By the time police arrived, all 3 boys were dead. This was not a disappearance. There was no mystery about where the children went. There were no days of searching, no frantic Amber Alerts, no unanswered questions about who was responsible. The killer was still at the scene, calm enough to be arrested without resistance. Their father, Chad Dorman. The violence unfolded rapidly, but deliberately. Dorman retrieved a .22 caliber rifle from inside the home. What followed was not an accidental discharge or a chaotic struggle. One of the boys tried to run. He was chased down. Another attempted to hide. It didn't matter. The boy's mother, Laura Dorman, was there. She tried to stop it. At one point, she physically put herself between her children and the gun. She was shot in the hand while trying to shield them. Bleeding, she managed to escape the house and run into the street, screaming for help. A 14-year-old stepdaughter was also present. She ran for her life and helped alert neighbors. Her escape likely saved her own life. By the time first responders entered the home, the 3 boys were already gone. Chad Dorman was taken into custody at the scene. He did not flee. He did not fight. Officers found him sitting on the steps outside the house. The rifle was recovered. There was no confusion about what had happened. The reaction was immediate and explosive. This case detonated across national headlines because it struck a nerve that never dulls. A father murdering his own young children. There was no ideological manifesto, no cult, no financial motive that the public could argue about. Just a parent turning into the most immediate threat imaginable. As investigators pieced together what led up to that day, a more complicated picture began to emerge. Family members and attorneys later said Chad Dorman had been struggling with severe mental health issues. There were reports of paranoia, emotional instability, and overwhelming stress, but there had been no court order removing him from the home. No restraining order, no warning that clearly predicted what would happen next. In the days after the killings, prosecutors filed multiple charges. 3 counts of aggravated murder, kidnapping charges related to restraining the children, assault charges for shooting their mother. The state initially announced it would seek the death penalty. This was not a case the system rushed through. Dorman initially pleaded not guilty, then not guilty by reason of insanity. His attorneys filed motions to suppress evidence, challenged statements, and argued extensively about his mental state. Court hearings stretched on for months. Psychiatrists examined him. The legal process became long, complex, and heavily scrutinized. In court appearances, Dorman was not always emotionless. At times he cried. At other moments, he appeared withdrawn. His mental condition became one of the central issues of the case. But the prosecution never wavered on one point. Whatever his mental struggles, the acts themselves were intentional. Eventually, a plea deal was reached in 2024. In exchange for the state dropping the death penalty, Chad Dorman pleaded guilty to all charges. The deal ensured there would be no trial, no chance of acquittal, and no possibility that he would ever be released. At sentencing, the weight of what had been done filled the courtroom. Prosecutors detailed the final moments of the boys' lives. The judge imposed 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. No appeals path to freedom, no future hearing, no second chance. Chad Dorman will die in prison. Outside the courtroom, public anger never cooled. Vigils were held across the community. Churches filled with people who never knew the boys personally, but felt the loss anyway. Youth sports teams honored Clayton, who loved playing baseball. Parents hugged their children harder. Neighbors asked the same question that always follows cases like this. How does something like this go unnoticed until it's too late? The uncomfortable truth is that family annihilation rarely announces itself clearly. The warning signs are often vague. Stress, depression, isolation. This case is not distant history. It is not something softened by decades of time. It happened in 2023, in a normal house, in a place where children rode bikes and neighbors waved at each other. And it forces a realization that never gets easier to accept. Sometimes the most dangerous person in a child's life is the one society assumes will protect them at all costs. This is number 10. And if this story feels unbearable, understand this: it is only the beginning. In late December of 2019, while most families were preparing for the holidays, something far darker was happening inside a quiet home in Celebration, Florida. Behind closed doors, an entire family was being erased. By the time authorities entered the house in January of 2020, the damage had already been done. 44-year-old Anthony Tott's wife, Megan, was dead. His 3 children were dead. Alec, 13 years old. Tyler, 11. Zoe, just 4. Even the family dog, Breezy, had been killed. The house was silent. There was no sign of forced entry, no robbery, no struggle with an outsider. This was not a mystery about who did it. The man responsible was still alive and still inside the home. Anthony Tott did not fit the public's idea of what a family annihilator was supposed to look like. He wasn't unemployed. He wasn't isolated from society. He ran physical therapy clinics. He presented himself as educated, professional, and devoted to his family. The Totts lived in a planned community, known for safety, order, and the appearance of an ideal suburban life. That image collapsed the moment the truth surfaced. Law enforcement did not arrive at the Tott home because of a routine welfare check alone. Federal authorities were already circling Anthony Tott due to a healthcare fraud investigation tied to his physical therapy businesses. Allegations of fraudulent billing, financial irregularities, and looming legal consequences had begun to close in. His professional life was unraveling, and the pressure was mounting fast. When officers finally entered the home, they found something that went far beyond financial crime. Megan Tott and the children had been dead for an extended period. Not hours, not a single night. Reporting would later reveal that Anthony Tott had continued living in the house with their bodies for weeks before discovery, eating, sleeping, existing alongside the aftermath of what he had done. He had attempted to kill himself as well, but failed. When questioned, Anthony Tott did not immediately accept responsibility in a straightforward way. Instead, he offered a story that would become infamous. He claimed the world was about to end, that society was on the brink of collapse, that an undefined apocalypse was coming, one so catastrophic that death was preferable to survival. In his version of events, murder was mercy. But as investigators peeled back the layers, the apocalypse narrative began to crumble. There was no evidence Tott had been preparing for a real-world disaster. No emergency supplies, no consistent belief system, no outside influence pushing him toward an ideological end-of-days scenario. What did exist were mounting debts, failing businesses, and the very real threat of criminal charges that would destroy the image he had carefully built. The evidence showed that Tott poisoned his family with large doses of diphenhydramine, commonly known as Benadryl. But poisoning alone was not the end. Investigators described additional violence. The exact combination varied by victim, but suffocation, asphyxia, and stabbing were all presented during court proceedings. This was not a single method carried out in a moment of panic. It was layered, sustained, and intentional. At different points, Anthony Tott attempted to shift blame. He claimed his wife had killed the children, that he had only acted afterward. The forensic evidence contradicted him. Megan Tott had been the first to die. The story fell apart quickly. As the case moved toward trial, Tott's defense centered on his mental state. They argued he was delusional, overwhelmed, and detached from reality. They described a man crushed by stress and paranoia, convinced that he was sparing his family from something worse. The prosecution was unmoved. They focused on planning, on timing, on the prolonged period during which Tott lived with the bodies. on the lies he told, on the fact that when faced with financial ruin and legal exposure, he did not flee, confess, or ask for help. He chose annihilation. In 2022, after weeks of testimony, the jury reached its verdict. Anthony Tott was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for his wife and 1 for each child, along with a separate count of animal cruelty for killing Breezy, the family dog. The sentencing was absolute. 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, an additional penalty tied to the animal cruelty conviction. There would be no appeal that offered hope of release, no future hearing that could shorten his time behind bars. He will die in prison. The world did not end. There was no collapse, no apocalypse. The streets of celebration remained quiet. Life went on for everyone except the Totts. Anthony Tott still speaks in fragments of his original narrative, still framing himself as a protector rather than a destroyer. When his financial empire collapsed and his lies caught up to him, he did not accept exposure. He erased his family instead. This is number 9. And it is a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't announce themselves with rage or violence. Sometimes they wait until no one is watching, and then they decide no one else gets to survive their failure.
I wish she would look my way. She was so pretty today when she came over to the house. I just really want her.
For more than 2 years, Susan Powell was missing, and her husband was the last person to see her alive. That should have been the end of the story. It should have been the point where every door closed. Instead, the system opened one. On February 5th, 2012, a supervised visitation in Washington state turned into one of the most catastrophic failures of family court oversight in modern history. 2 young boys were delivered to their father for a court-approved visit. Within minutes, they were dead. This story does not begin with fire. It begins with a disappearance that poisoned everything that followed. In December of 2009, Susan Powell vanished from her home in West Valley City, Utah. She was 28 years old, a devoted mother, a woman trapped in a marriage friends later described as controlling and deeply unsettling. Her husband, Joshua Powell, claimed he took their sons on a late-night camping trip during a snowstorm and returned home to find Susan gone. Police didn't believe him. From the start, Joshua Powell was the primary suspect. His behavior was erratic. His explanations were inconsistent. Investigators uncovered evidence of marital strife, financial pressure, and disturbing journal entries revealing a man obsessed with control. But there was one problem that stalled everything. There was no body. Without Susan's remains, prosecutors could not file murder charges. And without charges, Joshua Powell remained legally free. As the investigation dragged on, the courts made a compromise that would later prove fatal. Susan's sons, Charlie and Braden, were removed from Joshua's custody and placed with Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. The boys were safe, loved, and stable. Joshua was granted only supervised visitation, tightly controlled and monitored by the state. On paper, the safeguards looked sufficient. In reality, they were nothing. On the afternoon of February 5th, 2012, a state-appointed social worker named Elizabeth Griffin Hall drove Charlie, 7, and Braden, 5, to their father's house in the South Hill area of Graham, Washington. The visit was supposed to be brief, supervised, controlled. The moment Joshua Powell opened the door, everything changed. He became agitated almost immediately. He ushered the boys inside, then slammed the door shut behind them. Elizabeth Griffin Hall ran to the door and tried to follow. It was locked. She began pounding. Inside, Joshua Powell refused to open it. Terrified, Griffin Hall ran back to her car and called 911. She tells the dispatcher she is afraid for the boys' lives. She says Joshua has locked her out and she can't see the children. Police and firefighters were dispatched immediately, but they were already too late. Inside the house, Joshua Powell attacked his sons with a hatchet. and he ignited gasoline he had poured throughout the home, triggering a massive explosion. The blast rocked the neighborhood. Flames tore through the structure. Fire crews arrived to an inferno they could not enter. Joshua Powell and both boys died in the fire. Investigators would later confirm the explosion was intentional. Gasoline was used to accelerate the blaze. This was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was a planned murder-suicide, carried out during a narrow window when the system gave him access to the people he wanted most to control. The public reaction was immediate and furious. How could the prime suspect in a mother's disappearance be allowed alone with his children? How could a supervised visit collapse so completely? Why were warnings ignored? As the case was examined in the aftermath, the warning signs became impossible to deny. Joshua Powell had been unraveling for years. Financial stress, isolation, a belief that his children were extensions of himself rather than individuals. In the days leading up to the attack, he sent emails and left voicemails that read like farewells. In one message, he said he could not live without his sons and that he was calling to say goodbye. This was not confusion, it was ownership. The deeper investigators looked, the darker the story became. Joshua Powell's family was not blameless in the broader tragedy. His father, Stephen Powell, had been obsessively fixated on Susan, writing explicit journal entries about her and making her deeply uncomfortable before she vanished. His brother, Michael Powell, would later be identified by police as someone they believed helped Joshua conceal Susan's body after her murder. Susan's remains were never found. West Valley City Police have publicly stated their belief that Joshua Powell murdered his wife. Her case remains officially unsolved, only because the man responsible died before he could be charged. In death, Joshua Powell controlled the narrative, the same way he controlled his family in life. There was no trial, just ashes. The Powell case is especially haunting because it shows how danger can be visible and still ignored. Experts warned the court. Joshua was unstable. Susan's parents begged for stronger protections. Social workers expressed concern. But procedure moved forward anyway. Charlie and Braden retreated like case numbers, instead of children facing a clear and present threat. And when the system finally realized its mistake, the realization came in fire. This is number 8, and it is one of the most devastating reminders that sometimes the warning signs are not subtle at all. They are screaming, and no one listens until it's too late. In April of 2011, a well-to-do family in Nantes, France, seemed to vanish overnight. No screams, no struggle visible from the street, no forced entry. At first, fans were told the family had relocated suddenly. Schools were notified the children would not be returning. Emails were sent explaining that a new life had begun abroad, under unusual circumstances. The house sat closed and quiet, as if the family had simply stepped out of existence. But they hadn't left. They were buried beneath their own home. Under the back terrace of that house, investigators would uncover one of the most disturbing family annihilations in modern European history. The bodies of a mother, 4 children, and the family's 2 dogs, all carefully concealed by the man who was supposed to protect them. Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès was not an obvious monster. He came from an old aristocratic French family. He was articulate, educated, and deeply concerned with appearances. He liked order, structure, control. To outsiders, he presented himself as a devoted husband and father, navigating financial challenges with dignity. Behind that image, everything was collapsing. By early 2011, Xavier's business ventures had failed. He was buried in debt. Creditors were closing in. His self-image as a successful patriarch was crumbling, and for a man obsessed with status and legacy, failure was intolerable. Instead of facing it, he chose erasure. Over the course of several days in early April, Xavier murdered his entire family. His wife, Agnès, 48 years old, Arthur, 21, Thomas, 18, Anne, 16, Benoit, just 13. Investigators later determined that the victims were drugged with sleeping pills before being shot with a .22 long rifle. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds. The killings were carried out in a controlled, deliberate manner, most likely while the family slept. One detail made the case even colder. Thomas, the oldest son, did not live at home full-time. He was away at school. Xavier called him back under a false pretext, telling him there had been an emergency involving his mother. When Thomas returned home, he was killed too. No one was spared. After the murders, Xavier did not flee in panic. He buried them. Beneath the terrace at the back of the house, he dug shallow graves. Each body was wrapped carefully. Quicklime was used, a detail that suggested an attempt to manage decomposition and odor. The family's 2 dogs were killed and buried as well, their presence erased alongside the humans they belonged to. Then Xavier cleaned. Blood was removed. Beds were dismantled. The house was staged to look abandoned rather than violent. Subscriptions were cancelled. Letters were sent. Bills were paid. To friends, relatives, and schools, he sent emails explaining what had happened. In them, Xavier claimed that he had been recruited by US authorities into a covert government operation. He said his family had been placed into witness protection, that their disappearance was necessary, secret, and permanent. The tone was calm, official, and disturbingly convincing. For a short time, it worked. But something felt wrong. No one heard from Agnes. None of the children contacted friends. Eventually, relatives contacted police, unable to ignore the silence any longer. When investigators searched the home, they initially found nothing conclusive. The house was oddly empty but not chaotic. It felt curated, artificial. Then, they searched the terrace. Under the concrete, they found the graves. 7 bodies. The revelation stunned France. As investigators pieced together the timeline, surveillance footage filled in what happened next. After burying his family, Xavier began traveling south through France. He stayed in hotels, ate meals at restaurants, withdrew cash, mailed letters to friends, some of them strangely reflective, thanking people for their support and hinting at a final goodbye. He appeared calm. On April 14, 2011, Xavier was captured on hotel surveillance footage in the town of Roquebrune-sur-Argens, near the Mediterranean coast. The next day, April 15th, his car was found abandoned nearby. Footage showed him walking away toward a mountainous wooded area with a bag slung over his shoulder. That was the last confirmed sighting. He was never seen again. No body was found, no suicide note recovered, no arrest made. French authorities launched a massive manhunt. International alerts were issued. Tips poured in from across Europe, the United States, South America, even Asia. Every reported sighting reignited the case. In 2019, the world believed it was finally over. A man was arrested in Scotland after arriving from France. For hours, headlines announced that Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès had been captured. Then DNA testing destroyed that hope. It was the wrong man. The case collapsed back into uncertainty. To this day, investigators are divided. Some believe Xavier committed suicide shortly after abandoning his car, his body hidden in the wilderness. Others believe he planned his escape as meticulously as he planned the murders. He had cash, he had time, he had cut ties cleanly, and he had nothing left to lose. What makes this case uniquely haunting is the intelligence behind it. This was not a man who snapped in the moment of rage. This was a father who planned, executed, concealed, and vanished. Every year that passes leaves one terrifying possibility intact, that a man capable of murdering his entire family, burying them beneath his own home, and calmly walking away might still be walking free. This is number 7. A father who didn't just destroy his family, he erased them, and then disappeared into the world he believed he was smarter than. On the morning of April 10th, 2001, a quiet home in Scottsdale, Arizona, exploded. Flames tore through the house. Windows shattered. Smoke rolled into the sky. Firefighters rushed in, expecting a gas accident or a routine house fire. What they found instead was a family annihilation. Inside the burned home were the bodies of Mary Fisher and her 2 children. 12-year-old Brittany, 10-year-old Bobby. All three were already dead before the fire ever started. The man who killed them was gone. Robert William Fisher was not at the scene. He never would be again. From the outside, the Fisher family looked stable. Robert worked in the medical field as a respiratory therapist and had previous experience connected to firefighting and emergency services. Mary was a devoted mother. The family attended church regularly. Their children were active, social, and well-liked. But behind closed doors, the marriage was unraveling. Friends later described Robert Fisher as controlling and volatile. Arguments were frequent. Police had been called to the home before. Mary had confided to others that she was considering divorce, a word that carried enormous weight for a man obsessed with control, authority, and image. For Robert Fisher, abandonment was not an option. Investigators believe that sometime during the night, Robert Fisher murdered his family while they slept. Mary was shot in the back of the head. Her children were not shot. Their throats were slit, a far more personal and brutal method that shocked even seasoned detectives. This was not random violence. It was intimate, deliberate. After killing his family, Fisher turned the house itself into a weapon. Rather than simply setting a fire, investigators believe he pulled a gas line inside the home, allowing gas to accumulate overnight. In the early morning hours of April 10th, the house ignited, causing a powerful explosion designed to destroy evidence and buy time. It worked, temporarily. But fire doesn't erase everything. Autopsies confirmed the family was dead before the explosion. The fire was not the cause of death. It was a distraction. Robert Fisher had planned his disappearance. For more than a week after the explosion, he was gone without a trace. Then, on April 20th, 2001, 10 days later, investigators found Mary Fisher's Toyota 4Runner abandoned near the small town of Young, Arizona, deep in the rugged terrain bordering the Tonto National Forest. Nearby, the family dog, Blue, was found alive. Robert Fisher was not. The area around Young is unforgiving. Thick forest, rocky canyons, miles of wilderness where trails vanish and search efforts collapse into nothing. For most people, it would be a death sentence. For Robert Fisher, it was familiar ground. He was an experienced outdoorsman, a hunter, a survivalist. He knew how to live off the land. He knew how to disappear. Search teams combed the forest. Helicopters scanned from above. Tracking dogs followed scent trails that simply ended. Nobody was ever found. At first, many believed Fisher had taken his own life in the wilderness, but the forest had claimed him. But as days turned into months, and months into years, doubt crept in. There was no trace, no remains, no weapon, no confirmation of death. Investigators began to consider a more disturbing possibility. Robert Fisher may have escaped. Evidence showed he had prepared. He had access to firearms, survival gear, knowledge of remote routes, and possibly connections that could help him start over. The explosion wasn't just rage, it was misdirection. In 2002, the FBI placed Robert William Fisher on its 10 most wanted fugitives list. His face appeared on billboards, in post offices, and on television across the country. He was described as armed, dangerous, and extremely disciplined. Tips poured in from everywhere. Mexico, Canada, rural towns where men lived off-grid. Each report sparked hope. Each one fell apart. Years passed. In 2021, the FBI removed Fisher from the top 10 list. Not because he was found, not because he was cleared, but because the list prioritizes cases where new publicity can generate leads, and Fisher's case had already received decades of saturation. The warrant remains active. The reward remains. Robert William Fisher is still wanted. Born April 13th, 1961. He would be in his 60s today. Older, possibly heavier, possibly gray. But investigators believe he could still be alive, living under a false identity, blending into places where questions aren't asked. What haunts this case is not just the brutality, It's the possibility that it worked. That Robert Fisher succeeded. That somewhere, a man who murdered his wife and children is still breathing free air, still watching sunsets, still living the future he stole from his family. No trial, no confession, no grave. This is number 6. A father who turned his home into a crime scene, his family into casualties, and the wilderness into his escape plan. And more than 20 years later, one question still refuses to die. Did Robert William Fisher perish in the forest, or did he get away with it? On March 1st, 1976, William Bradford Bishop Jr. left his office at the U.S. State Department, drove home to Bethesda, Maryland, and decided his life was over. Not just his career, not just his marriage, everything. By the end of that night, 5 people were dead, and the man responsible would vanish so completely that nearly 50 years later, no one can say with certainty where he went or if he ever paid for what he did. William Bradford Bishop Jr. was not an ordinary killer. He was an elite government employee, a trained diplomat, fluent in multiple languages, educated, polished, and trusted with sensitive information. He understood systems, borders, and how authority works, and that made him uniquely dangerous when everything started to fall apart. Earlier that day, Bishop learned he would not receive a promotion he desperately wanted. For years, his career had stalled. Supervisors described him as arrogant and entitled, a man who believed he was smarter than everyone around him. Being passed over wasn't just a professional disappointment. To Bishop, it was humiliation. That same day, he withdrew cash and went shopping. Investigators later determined he purchased items including a ball-peen hammer, a gas can, a shovel, and a pitchfork. These were not random errands. They were preparations. That night, inside the family home in Bethesda, Bishop murdered his entire household. His wife, Annette, his mother, Nabelia, and his 3 sons, William Jr., 14, Brenton, 10, and Jeffrey, 5. The murders were brutal and personal. Investigators concluded Bishop used the hammer to beat them to death, one by one. But Bishop wasn't finished. After the murders, he loaded the bodies into his station wagon. Then he drove south, calmly, deliberately, more than 300 miles. In a remote wooded area near Columbia, North Carolina, Bishop dug a shallow pit. He placed the bodies inside, poured gasoline over them, and set them on fire. Forest rangers later reported seeing smoke rising from the area. When they investigated, they found the burned remains of 5 people. At that point, police still didn't know who the victims were. The discovery of the bodies came first, not the house. Only later did investigators trace the victims back to Bethesda. By March 10th, after a neighbor grew concerned about the abandoned home and a family's sudden absence, police entered the house. Inside, they found bloodstains and signs of extreme violence. William Bradford Bishop Jr. was nowhere to be found. The investigation quickly zeroed in on him as the prime and only suspect. His shopping trip, his career meltdown, his sudden disappearance, everything lined up. Then came another discovery. Bishop's station wagon was found abandoned, not in North Carolina, but in Tennessee, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park area, near Elkmont. Blood evidence was found in and around the vehicle. The location suggested something chilling. He had planned this in stages. North Carolina was where he disposed of the bodies. Tennessee was where he disappeared. With his education, language skills, and overseas experience, Bishop had every tool necessary to vanish. He had lived abroad before. He understood how to blend in, how to become invisible. The FBI launched a massive manhunt. His face appeared on wanted posters across the country. International alerts were issued. Given his background, authorities believed he could easily flee the United States and start over elsewhere. Sightings poured in: Italy, France, Switzerland, South America. Small towns where elderly men lived quietly, speaking multiple languages, keeping to themselves. Every lead raised hope. Every lead collapsed. Years passed, then decades. Unlike many fugitives, investigators never believed Bishop committed suicide. There was no evidence pointing to it. No body, no weapon, no final message. Everything about his actions suggested he intended to live, just not as William Bradford Bishop Jr. In 2018, the FBI removed Bishop from its 10 most wanted fugitives list, not because he was found, not because the case was closed, but because he no longer fit the list's criteria for inclusion. The warrant remains active. He is still officially wanted. Born in 1936, Bishop would now be in his late 80s, and that's what makes the case so disturbing. He didn't disappear in a panic. He didn't leave behind chaos. He executed a plan. He prepared. He killed. He transported bodies. He destroyed evidence. He staged a secondary disappearance point. And then he stepped out of his own life. 5 lives erased in a single night because one man could not tolerate professional failure. This is number 5. A father who used his intelligence not to protect his family, but to annihilate them and escape accountability. And the question that refuses to go away remains chillingly simple. What if William Bradford Bishop Jr. didn't just disappear, but lived out the rest of his life, knowing he got away with it? Christian Longo loved the way he looked from the outside. Young, clean-cut, confident. The kind of guy who could shake your hand, smile at your kids, and convince you he had everything under control. A husband, a father of 3, a man who talked about responsibility like it was a religion. But in December of 2001, Christian Longo didn't just fail his family. He erased them. And then he tried to erase himself. This isn't the story of a man who snapped in public. It's the story of a man who panicked privately and decided his image mattered more than 4 lives. By the winter of 2001, Longo's life was collapsing under the weight of his own lies. He was drowning financially, bills piling up, debts stacking, trust evaporating. He'd lied to employers, lied to friends, lied to family, and inside his marriage, those lies were detonating everything. His wife, Mary Jane Longo, was in her mid-30s, a mother who'd carried the load while her husband played the role of provider. Reports later made it clear the relationship was strained, unstable, and cracking. Divorce wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was a threat. And for Christian Longo, that threat wasn't about love. It was about exposure, because once a marriage ends, people start asking questions. Money, work, why the story doesn't match the lifestyle, why the numbers don't add up. A man like Longo doesn't just fear losing his wife, he fears losing the mask. So sometime in December 2001, he made a choice that turned him into one of the most hated fathers in modern American true crime. His 3 children were so little. Zachary was 5, Sadie was 3, Madison was 2. These weren't teenagers he couldn't control. These were toddlers, the kind of kids who run to you just because you walked into the room. Longo killed them anyway. The details that emerged were brutal, but telling. Autopsy reporting would later describe different causes of death across the victims. Zachary and Sadie were killed by asphyxiation. Mary Jane and Madison were strangled. Then came the part that made the case feel especially cold. Longo didn't dump them in a panic. He didn't leave them somewhere random and run. He packaged them. He used suitcases. Mary Jane and Madison, in particular, were found inside suitcases in coastal waters, like luggage, like something to be transported and discarded. As the days passed, the ocean started giving pieces of the truth back. Zachary's body was recovered first, on December 19th, 2001. That discovery wouldn't just shock the area, it turned a missing family situation into something darker. Then, on December 22nd, Sadie was found. And on December 27th, Mary Jane and Madison were recovered in Yakima Bay, near Newport. That's the moment the case stopped being what happened to the Longos and became Find Christian Longo Now. Because by then, he was already gone. While Oregon was discovering his family one by one, Longo was running, trying to turn distance into innocence. And here's what makes him different from the sloppy liars who get caught immediately. Christian Longo wasn't running like a man afraid. He was running like a man who thought his lie would work. He fled the country, heading to Mexico, and adopted a new identity. He didn't hide in a shack or live like a fugitive, sleeping in ditches. He tried to live normally, socialize, blend in, act like the man everyone thought he was. He used the name Michael Finkel, claiming to be a freelance journalist. The confidence of that move is the giveaway. Back in the United States, investigators built the case fast, and Christian Longo became a national manhunt target. That list isn't for ordinary criminals. That's for people the government believes are dangerous enough that they need the loudest possible spotlight. 2 days later, that spotlight worked. Longo was recognized in Mexico, and on January 13th, 2002, he was captured near Tulum. Not in some dramatic shootout, not in a blaze of glory. He was caught because reality doesn't care how convincing your fake name is when your face is on every screen. He was extradited back to the United States, and once he was in court, the mask came back on. Because the courtroom is where manipulators do what they do best: rewrite the narrative. Christian Longo didn't just deny it, he tried to redirect it. He claimed Mary Jane killed the children, 2 of them, and injured the 3rd. He framed it like he walked into a nightmare and responded in rage, saying he killed her afterward. It's a story built for sympathy. Prosecutors tore that story apart. The forensic evidence didn't match. The timeline didn't match. The disposal didn't match. You don't panic into suitcases in methodical coastal dumping. You don't accidentally become a fugitive in another country under a fake identity. The jury saw what he was: a man who chose annihilation over humiliation. Christian Longo was convicted of murdering his wife and children and sentenced to death. And then, years later, another twist. In 2022, Oregon Governor Kate Brown commuted the state's death row sentences, including Longo's, to life in prison without the possibility of parole, so he will not be executed. But he will also never be released. He will die in a cell, alive long enough to age, long enough to reflect, long enough to sit with the fact that the one thing he tried to preserve, his image, is permanently destroyed. This is number 4. A father who thought he could zip his family into suitcases, drop them into the cold Pacific, change his name, and live a fresh life, only to learn that some crimes don't dissolve. They surface. For 2 days, a young mother and her infant daughter lay dead inside a quiet Massachusetts townhouse. No one heard them, no one saw them, and the man who should have been there was already gone. This is not a story about a crime discovered immediately. It's a story about absence and what that absence revealed. On January 20th, 2006, inside a townhouse in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, 27-year-old Rachel Entwistle and her 9-month-old daughter, Linian Rose, were shot and killed. But their bodies would not be discovered until 2 days later, on January 22nd, after a welfare check failed to notice them. By the time police finally understood what had happened, the father of the child was already thousands of miles away. Neil Entwistle didn't flee into the night. He fled across the Atlantic. To friends and family, the Entwistles appeared to be a young couple building a life. Neil was British. Rachel was American. They had recently moved from England to Massachusetts, so Rachel could be closer to her family. On the surface, this looked like a fresh start. Behind that image, everything was unraveling. Neil Entwistle was unemployed. His business ventures had failed. Credit card debt was mounting. Money problems followed him from the UK to the United States. And Rachel had begun confiding in others that the marriage was not working. Divorce was being discussed. For Neil Entwistle, divorce wasn't just the end of a relationship. It meant exposure. It meant admitting failure. It meant losing control over the narrative he'd built around himself as a capable husband and father. Sometime on January 20th, That pressure exploded. Rachel and Lillian were shot while lying together in the master bedroom. Bedding had been placed over their bodies, obscuring them from view. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a stranger inside the home. The weapon was a .22 caliber Colt revolver, a small, quiet firearm connected to Rachel's father's gun collection. The forensic details were chilling. One bullet passed through Rachel and into Lillian. The caliber mattered. A .22 doesn't always announce itself the way larger weapons do. It's subtle, controlled, intentional. After the killings, Neil Entwistle did not call for help. He did not attempt CPR. He did not alert Rachel's parents who lived nearby. Instead, he left. On January 21st, around 5 o'clock in the morning, Neil purchased a one-way ticket out of the United States. He went to Logan Airport in Boston and boarded a flight to London using his British passport. By the time Rachel's family became concerned and contacted police, Neil Entwistle was already airborne. First welfare check failed. Officers entered the townhouse but did not notice the bodies. The bedroom appeared undisturbed. The victims were covered. The scene did not scream violence at a glance. It wasn't until a second check, 2 days later, that police fully searched the bedroom and made the horrific discovery. Once the bodies were found, the case moved fast. Investigators immediately focused on Neil Entwistle. The absence, the flight, the financial problems. Everything pointed inward, not outward. And then, the digital trail emerged. Prosecutors would later reveal that before the murders, Neil Entwistle had searched the internet for information related to killing, murder, and violent acts. This wasn't curiosity after the fact. It was preparation. It was intent. In February of 2006, Neil Entwistle was located in England. He wasn't hiding in a bunker or running through alleyways. He was arrested by London police on the Underground, near Royal Oak Station, as if he were just another commuter on a morning commute, not a man accused of killing his wife and infant daughter. He was extradited back to the United States to face trial. And that's where the story took its most predictable turn. Neil Entwistle claimed innocence. He told investigators there had been an intruder, that he came home to find Rachel and Lillian already dead, that he panicked, that he fled because he knew he would be blamed. But the evidence didn't support panic. It supported planning. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle with another person. Gunshot residue was found on Neil's clothing. His fingerprints were connected to the firearm. His internet searches showed forethought. And his behavior afterward, buying a one-way ticket, leaving the country immediately, spoke louder than any words he offered later. Prosecutors argued that Neil Entwistle killed his wife and child because his life was collapsing. No job, no money, no way to maintain the image he'd sold to Rachel and her family. Divorce would have exposed everything. So instead of being left, he eliminated the problem. At trial, the defense tried to introduce doubt. They questioned forensic handling. They suggested procedural errors. They floated the idea of an unknown intruder without ever identifying one. The jury wasn't convinced. In 2008, Neil Entwistle was convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of Rachel and Lillian. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will never be released. Even after conviction, Entwistle continued to claim innocence. Appeals followed. Motions were filed. Each one failed. The evidence remained overwhelming. The verdict stood. Rachel never got the chance to leave a marriage she was questioning. Lillian never got the chance to take her first steps. Their lives ended quietly, under blankets, in a bedroom meant to be safe. This is number 3. A father who tried to outrun justice by crossing an ocean and learned that evidence travels farther than he ever could. On November 9th, 1971, in Westfield, New Jersey, a father carried out one of the most calculated family murders in American history. Then he disappeared. Not overnight, not for a few weeks. For merely 18 years. John Emil List didn't run in panic. He didn't unravel under guilt. He didn't confess in a moment of weakness. He killed his family, locked the door behind him, and quietly stepped into an entirely new life. While the bodies of his loved ones decomposed inside the house he left behind. This was not a crime of rage. It was a crime of belief. John List was rigid, disciplined, and deeply religious. He believed in obedience, hierarchy, and moral authority. He worked as an accountant. He attended church faithfully. To outsiders, he was dull, reserved, almost invisible. Inside his home in Westfield, pressure was building towards something lethal. By 1971, List's life was collapsing. He had lost his job. His finances were in ruin. Mortgage payments were overdue. The family was living far beyond what he could afford, largely because he refused to downsize from their massive Victorian mansion. Worse still, in his mind, his family was drifting morally. His wife, Helen, no longer followed his strict religious expectations. His teenage daughter challenged his authority. His sons were growing into young men who questioned him. To John List, this wasn't normal family conflict. It was spiritual corruption. And to a man like List, spiritual failure was worse than death. On the morning of November 9th, after pretending it was just another school day, John List began killing his family. He started with his wife. Helen was drinking coffee in the kitchen when John shot her in the back of the head. There was no argument, no confrontation, just execution. He used one of two firearms, a 9mm Steyr pistol and a .22 caliber revolver, weapons he owned legally and knew how to use. Next, he waited. Later that day, his mother Alma returned to her attic apartment in the house. She was 84 years old. John followed her upstairs and shot her as well. Then he turned to his children. His daughter Patricia, 16, came home from school first. He shot her in the back of the head. Her body would later be moved to the ballroom. His youngest son, Frederick, 13, arrived home next. He was killed the same way. But John List wasn't finished. His oldest son, John Jr., 15 years old, was not home yet. Instead of fleeing or continuing immediately, List did something that reveals how controlled and deliberate he was. He left the house and went to watch John Jr. play in a soccer game. He sat on the sidelines. He watched his son run across the field. He behaved like a normal father. Then he brought him home and killed him. 5 members of his family were dead before dinner. Afterward, John List began staging the scene. He laid the bodies of his wife and children on sleeping bags in the ballroom of the house. He believed he was preparing them for the afterlife. Then he tried to preserve the scene. He lowered the thermostat to slow decomposition. He turned on a radio and tuned it to a religious station, letting sermons and hymns play continuously. He removed his own image from family photographs throughout the house, a symbolic erasure of himself from the family he had just destroyed. He also created cover stories. Letters were sent to the children's schools, claiming they would be away visiting an ailing relative. Notes were written to explain absences. Everything was designed to delay discovery. Then, John List walked out the front door. For nearly a month, no one noticed. Neighbors assumed the family was traveling. Mail piled up. Finally, on December 7th, 1971, police entered the home. After noticing the absence had gone on too long, what they found was horrifying. 5 decomposing bodies, carefully arranged, and a handwritten confession letter. In it, John List calmly explained why he had done it. He wrote that he believed he had saved his family from moral decay, that he feared they would lose their souls. That death was preferable to eternal damnation. There was no apology, no regret, just justification. John List was already gone. For 17 years, 6 months, and 23 days, he lived undetected. He changed his name to Robert Peter Clark. He moved across the country. He remarried. He joined a church. He got another accounting job. He became a quiet, reliable, deeply religious man once again. No one around him suspected a thing. He blended in perfectly. John List had succeeded until 1989. That year, America's Most Wanted aired a segment on the case. A forensic artist named Frank Bender created an age-progressed clay bust, showing what John List might look like decades later. The resemblance was uncanny. Someone who knew Robert Clark saw the segment and recognized him. A tip was called in. Investigators followed it carefully. On June 1st, 1989, John List was arrested at an accounting office in the Richmond area town of Midlothian, Virginia. He did not resist. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. His confession letter, ballistics, the timeline, the life he rebuilt under a false name. In 1990, John List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He would never be released. John List died behind bars in 2008. This is number 2. A father who believed he was morally justified in deciding who deserved to live, and proved that sometimes the most dangerous killers aren't the ones who run. They're the ones who disappear into plain sight. This is where the list ends, not with certainty, but with controversy. More than 50 years later, Jeffrey MacDonald still claims he is innocent, and the argument over whether he is telling the truth or hiding one of the most calculated family murders in American history has never stopped. In the early morning hours of February 17th, 1970, military police responded to an emergency call at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Colette MacDonald was dead. She was 26 years old. Their daughters were also dead. Kimberly, age 5, and Kristen, just 2 years old. One person was still alive, Captain Jeffrey MacDonald. MacDonald was an Army physician assigned to Special Forces. He was intelligent, articulate, and trained to remain calm under pressure. When police arrived, he was injured but conscious, and he immediately told them what he said had happened. According to MacDonald, he had fallen asleep on the couch and was awakened by intruders inside the home. He described 3 men and 1 woman. He claimed the woman wore a floppy hat and boots, held a candle, and chanted phrases like "acid is groovy" and "kill the pigs." He said he fought them, was stabbed and beaten unconscious, and when he came to, his family was dead and the attackers were gone. The story landed in a very specific moment in American history. This was the height of the Vietnam War, the counterculture movement, and public fear surrounding cult violence. The Manson murders were still fresh in the national psyche. To many people at the time, the idea of drug-fueled intruders targeting a military family didn't sound impossible, but investigators inside the house immediately began seeing problems. The crime scene did not match MacDonald's account. The violence appeared to unfold in stages, not as a sudden, chaotic home invasion. Blood patterns suggested movement from room to room. Fibers from MacDonald's pajama top were found beneath his wife's body and under his daughter's, suggesting the garment was torn during the killings themselves rather than during a separate struggle. In the master bedroom, the word "pig" was written in blood on the headboard, a detail that many investigators believed looked staged, as if someone was trying to force the scene into a cult attack narrative. Weapons associated with the home were recovered, including a knife, an ice pick, and a piece of wood used as a club. None of it clearly supported the presence of unknown attackers. The focus kept circling back to the only adult survivor. MacDonald's injuries also raised questions. He had wounds, but many were superficial. The level of violence inflicted on Colette and the children was far greater than what he sustained. Investigators struggled to reconcile his description of a vicious, multi-attacker struggle with the physical evidence on his body. The Army conducted the first investigation. Later, in 1970, after a military hearing, charges were dismissed. MacDonald was honorably discharged. To many observers, that looked like vindication. He moved to California and resumed life as a civilian physician. But the case did not disappear. Civilian investigators continued reviewing the evidence. Forensic interpretations were revisited. Witness statements were re-examined. The inconsistencies did not go away. In 1975, 5 years after the murders, a federal grand jury indicted Jeffrey MacDonald on 3 counts of murder. The delay itself became part of the controversy, with supporters later arguing that time had corrupted evidence, while critics argued the government took years because of the seriousness of accusing an army officer of killing his family. The trial finally took place in 1979. Prosecutors argued that MacDonald murdered his family after an argument with his wife, and then staged the crime scene to resemble a cult-style home invasion. They focused on forensic evidence, blood patterns, fiber transfer, and the lack of credible proof that intruders had ever been there. The defense countered with claims of tunnel vision, mishandled evidence, and investigators who locked onto MacDonald early and refused to consider alternative explanations. They pointed to alleged sightings of a woman resembling the floppy hat description and framed MacDonald as a man destroyed by a justice system desperate to correct its earlier mistake. The jury listened and deliberated. Jeffrey MacDonald was convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. For most cases, that would be the end. For this one, it was only the beginning. MacDonald never changed his story. He continued to insist that intruders were responsible. Over the decades, he filed appeal after appeal. He gained supporters, including lawyers, journalists, and former investigators who believed the case was deeply flawed. Books were written, documentaries were produced, entire careers were built, arguing both sides of his guilt. Some believe the evidence against him is overwhelming. A staged scene, inconsistent injuries, forensic contradictions, and no credible proof that intruders ever existed. Others believe the case was poisoned by early mistakes and confirmation bias, but investigators decided MacDonald was guilty and built the case backward from that conclusion. Even today, there is no universal agreement. MacDonald remains in federal prison. He has aged behind bars. He has never confessed. He has never recanted his intruder story. To supporters, that consistency is proof of innocence. To critics, it is proof of discipline and control. That is why this case never fades. It isn't just about evidence. It's about what people believe humans are capable of. Can a father and doctor murder his pregnant wife and 2 daughters and calmly explain it away? Or can a justice system lock onto the wrong narrative and destroy someone beyond recovery? That's why this is number 1. Not because it's the most graphic or the most shocking, but because it guarantees debate. Jeffrey MacDonald didn't just leave behind a crime scene. He left behind a question that refuses to die. From the fathers who vanished without a trace to the ones who turned their own homes into crime scenes, these stories represent the ultimate betrayal of the parental role. They were supposed to protect, provide, and guide. Instead, they destroyed the very lives they were meant to safeguard. Their actions leave lasting scars on families, communities, and our understanding of how power and control can turn deadly. They are, without question, among the most evil fathers in history. If you found this deep dive into these disturbing cases compelling, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Which case disturbed you the most? And do you think any of these men were capable of redemption?